Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 30 minutes of Torah study for the Torah portion of Re'eh. We will begin with a brief overview of the Torah portion. See, says Moshe to the people of Israel, I place before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing that will come when they fulfill God's commandments, and the curse if they abandon them. These shall be proclaimed on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal when the people cross over into the Holy Land. A temple should be established in the place that God will choose to make his name, where the people should bring their sacrifices to him. It is forbidden to make offerings to God in any other place. It is permitted to slaughter animals elsewhere, not as sacrifices, but to eat their meat. The blood, which in the temple is poured upon the altar, however, may not be eaten. A false prophet, or one who entices others to worship idols, should be put to death. An idolatrous city must be destroyed. The identifying signs for kosher animals and fish, and the list of non-kosher birds, first given in the second chapter of Leviticus, are repeated. A tenth of all produce is to be eaten in Jerusalem, or else exchanged for money, with which food is purchased and eaten there. In certain years, this tithe is given to the poor instead. Firstborn cattle and sheep are to be offered in the temple, and their meat eaten by the Kohanim, the priests. The mitzvah of charity obligates a Jew to aid a needy fellow with a gift or loan. On the sabbatical year, occurring every 7th year, all loans are to be forgiven. All indentured servants are to be set free after 6 years of service. Our parsha concludes with the laws of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, when all should go to see and be seen before God in the Holy Temple. Because of the conclusion of this Torah portion, many times on the second day of a holiday, we will read from this week's Torah portion as the holiday reading. So there's a very important figure in Jewish history. In Hebrew, his name was Yochanan HaKohen Gadol, right? Yochanan the High Priest. In English, his name was John Hyrcanus. You could look on Wikipedia, you can see all kinds of historical artifacts about him, coins that he minted, and so on. He was the grandson of Matisyahu, the one who founded the whole Maccabean revolt. Matisyahu had a son named Shimon. Shimon's son was Yochanan. Yochanan was a very powerful person. He was a military leader. He was a political leader. He greatly expanded the borders of what was Israel at the time. He was a righteous person. He was a scholar. He was a Pharisee. What does a Pharisee mean? During the temple era, there was an internal division amongst the Jewish people. There were those who defended traditional Judaism, which included the oral Torah. Those were known as the Pharisees. And then there was a group of people who were opposed to the way Judaism had been practiced. They believed in a very literal interpretation of the biblical verse without any of the oral tradition, and they were called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were aligned with the Romans, so there was often this battle, this fight, this division between traditional Judaism, the rabbis, which were the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, which were aligned with the Romans and were much more Hellenistic. Who was Yochanan HaKohen Gadol? He was a Pharisee. He was the great defender of Jewish tradition. He served as a righteous Kohen Gadol, military leader, political leader for 80 years. At the end of his life, he became a heretic. At the end of his life, he abandoned being part of traditional Judaism, the Pharisees, and went over to the Sadducee camp. Based on his behavior, the Talmud coined the phrase, do not believe in yourself until the day you die. Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, righteous, special, wonderful, 80 years leading the Jewish people, and right before the end, right, he abandons his people. So Yochanan the High Priest lived a life of complete piety. How could he throw it all away at the end? If Yochanan the High Priest could throw it away at the end, if he could somehow be convinced and persuaded out of it, what chance do we have when we don't have that same pedigree? We don't have the same scholarship, right? We don't have that same background. How are we going to face the challenges of the modern secular world that poses to our tradition and to our faith? To answer the question, we're going to go into the Parsha. And the Parsha discusses persuasion. The Parsha says, what if somebody approaches you with the goal to persuade you, to entice you, they're missionizing you to some type of idol worship, some type of religious practice completely foreign and alien to Judaism. So we go to text number 1 here from the Parsha. If your brother tempts you in secret, your son, your daughter, your wife, your friend who is as your own soul, saying, let us go and worship other gods which neither you nor your forefathers have known, you shall not desire him, hearken to him, pity him, have mercy, nor shield him, but you shall surely kill him. So the Torah warns that it could happen that some family member tries to persuade you to another religion. You cannot have mercy or compassion on that person. First of all, you can't listen to them. But beyond that, you cannot have compassion and mercy on them. They are guilty of a capital crime, and the result is going to be in their death. The Torah lists a whole group of people here, clearly family members, who are trying to persuade you. However, we have one strange expression. It says here, your friend who is as your own soul. Right? If you were going to interpret that, to translate that into more plain English, who is your friend who is as your own soul? That might be another way of saying your best friend. Right? Would you agree that your friend who is as your own soul sounds like your best friend type of a thing? Right? A friend who is as close to you as your own soul. Why does the Torah use such a complex phrase to describe a best friend? It's just a little bit wordy, a little bit verbose. You could just say your best friend. So Rashi, right, the foremost biblical commentator, explains. So Rashi says, when it says, or your friend who is as your own soul, this refers to your father, not your best friend. Scripture enumerates those people who are dear to you. How much more so must you apply this to others and not spare them? So Rashi explains that this entire paragraph is all talking about family. And when it says that the friend who is as your own soul, that is referring to your father, right? Because your father is the person who you spend so much time with, who guides you, who educates you, who puts you on your feet, and so on and so forth. So it is referring to your father. What we see from here is, who are the people that a person is going to be most vulnerable to persuasion and missionizing? It is going to be close relatives, members of your family. Those are the people who have the greatest impact upon you. However, if you look at the list carefully, you'll notice that there are 2 relatives who are not on the list. They do not make the list of people that you have to be worried about proselytizing, missionizing, and trying to persuade you. Who are those people? Your mother and your sister. So why does the Torah omit the mother and the sister? So to answer this question, we need a better understanding of who is the target of the missionizing. When the Torah warns that you might be a target of persuasion, who is this person? One thing we know clearly from the text, that we're talking about a person who has a wife and children. How do we know this? Because the Torah says maybe you're going to be persuaded by your wife, or maybe you're going to be persuaded by your children. It is logical to assume that if a person has a wife and children, right, that you have brothers and sisters, and they are married and they have children, right? That is the age group of people that we're talking about over here. So that is who the target is. The target is a married person with children who also has siblings who have children as well. Right? That's the person. Now, what about the character, the personality, the background of the person? Let's go see what Rabbeinu Bachaya says. He says, he quotes the verse, which neither you nor your fathers have known, and he interprets it like this. He says it's possible that the Torah here alludes to 2 separate aspects of faith. One is based on tradition, the other on intelligence. What is the difference between tradition and intelligence? A person whose faith is primarily based on tradition is a person who's not necessarily scholarly, doesn't know the ins and outs, all the rules and regulations, is not familiar with the philosophical and theological underpinnings behind the behavior, but it's tradition. This is stuff that Jews do. My father did it, my mother did it, my grandfather did it, my grandmother did it. Approaches religion with the faith of Tevye the milkman. Tradition, not so much knowledge. Then you might have another person who, in addition to having tradition and an appreciation for tradition, also has tremendous amount of knowledge, scholarship, knows the ins and outs, the rules and regulations, the philosophy and the theology of Torah. So Rabbeinu Bechaya says, who is the person that the Torah is telling you is a target of persuasion? It's a person which neither you nor your forefathers have known. What does that mean? It's a person who both has tradition and a person who has knowledge. So we are discussing with a robust belief system. He's married, has children, his siblings are married with children. There's a person who possesses tradition as well as deep Torah scholarship. That is the person that the Torah is discussing, right? This is a person who took the time to ground his beliefs in rational thoughts. Being that that's the case, right, how is it possible that the person is going to be persuaded to idol worship? They have tradition and knowledge. So we can assume that this person was not persuaded by rational arguments alone, because the person also has rational arguments to counter those arguments. So it was not rational arguments alone. What was it that ultimately was able to convince this person? They were persuaded through intimacy or family closeness. Because you know what happens with family, right? Whether you want to say it's love that can blind you to perhaps faults in their arguments, or another way of saying it is, imagine this scenario. Maybe you have a health problem, and some people are trying to convince you to try alternative medicine. Now, I'm not making any comment on whether you should, you shouldn't, whether it's good or whether it's bad. But imagine the scenario, and your friends are telling you to take alternative medicine, and you're not excited about it. However, when your family members start talking to you about it, and your brother starts getting on your case, sometimes a person can be persuaded to do things that they otherwise would not normally do when their family gets involved, right? Does anyone agree that that's somewhat a plausible scenario, that a person can be persuaded by family perhaps more than other people? So this is what the Torah is trying to say, that the person is scholarly, knowledgeable, he's got all this stuff. How is it possible that they're persuaded into idol worship? Family, right? When family gets on your case, that's what happens. In the words of the Rebbe, the persuasion discussed in the verse, let us go and worship other gods, etc., can be accomplished in two different ways. One, through rational arguments in support of a particular belief. One who has influence over another individual's faith and belief, etc., may be able to convince them through rational arguments to go and worship other gods. Or two, through a neighborly or intimate relationship that one may have with another. By nature of this relationship alone, one may be able to influence another and convince them to worship idolatry, even without using any rational arguments to support their particular belief. However, it is obvious that even the first method of persuasion, where one tells another, let us go and worship other gods, that is, through rational arguments, is generally speaking only successful when there is an existing familial relationship. The closeness family engenders allows for persuasion on a scale large enough to lead to idol worship. Another reason to believe that the persuader is usually a family member is that he is able to access this man in private. So now that we have a pretty clear understanding that the person who is the persuader is a family member, we now need to figure who is the most likely family member who could be successful at persuading. The style of the Torah is to only tell us the most plausible story. Classic example of this is the Torah says if a person sees a donkey that is struggling with a load, even if that donkey belongs to your enemy, you still have to help them. Now, does that mean if it's an ox, you don't have to help? Does that mean if it's some other a camel, you don't have to help? Only the Torah only said a donkey? No, it applies to all animals. But the most common animal that was used at the time for transporting goods was a donkey. So the example that the Torah used is the most plausible example, not to exclude other people. It stands to reason that only the most plausible persuaders were listed. Now, what did we say? We said that the Torah did not list the mother and the sister. That doesn't mean they cannot be a persuader. They certainly can. But in the most plausible scenario, it's probably not your mother or sister that's going to persuade you to idol worship. Why? Well, first, let's talk about brothers. In the ideal family scenario, brothers have a certain bond, right? They have a certain connection. There's a closeness that brothers have. They hang out together. They have WhatsApp groups together, right? They have this, brothers are brothers, right? And therefore, you might be convinced by your brother, right? Your brother might have the ability to influence you. Your father, the Torah lists, because of course your father is your spiritual teacher, your economic teacher, probably taught you your trade, right? If you look at history, the influence that a father has over a son, so of course a father has the ability to persuade a son into idol worship. Who else does the Torah list? Your wife, right? This person, you're probably closer to your spouse than anyone else. You spend the most time with, you have a very unique and special relationship with your spouse. Your spouse has the ability to persuade you even over such a major religious issue. And then who else does the Torah list? Your kids, right? What a parent would not do for their kids, the love, the affection that a parent has for their kids. It is possible that a kid could be able to persuade their parents into idol worship. But what about your sister? The person that was detailed in the story is a person who's an adult who's married with kids. Their siblings are married with kids. A person's sister who's married with kids, odds are, would have less influence on you than your brother, your father, your kids, or your own wife. Your wife may be busier with their own family, and in general, a brother is not going to be as influenced by the arguments of their sister. So logically speaking, the sister is probably not the one. Could be the one, but not the one. And the same thing could be said about a person's mother. That a person gets married, a person has a family, a person has their own kids. You stand yourself on your own 2 feet. Yes, your mother may have advice. She may have thoughts that you will consider. Of course, a person loves their mother very deeply, but most adults are not going to be persuaded by their mother, right? They grew past that area of life. So this is why the Torah lists these family members and does not list the mother or the sister, because they're the least likely to be successful in persuading you into abandoning Judaism and to doing something else. Right? Any questions or comments before we begin part 2? Okay. Torah is not just a book of rules and regulations where we have laws about a persuader, what do you do, who is going to persuade, who's not going to persuade, and we want to understand the text. Now, yes, on the surface level, there are rules and regulations, and we have to know who does it apply to, who does it not apply to, why does the text include one person and not include another person. However, we understand that the Torah also speaks to us on a much deeper level. And within every mitzvah of the Torah, there's some type of practical advice that applies to each of our lives on a daily basis that is almost disconnected from whether a relative is going to be persuading us to idol worship or not. So we need to figure out what deeper meaning can we find in the story? How can we interpret it in a way that will enhance our own spiritual growth? So for the answer, of course, we turn to Hasidic philosophy, which tries to make every element of Torah relevant, practical, spiritually meaningful, and uplifting. Hasidic philosophy breaks the story down into three sections. There's three characters. Character number one is the persuader. Character number two is the target of the persuasion. Character number three is the struggle that a person goes through to not be affected and impacted by that persuasion. So first of all, who is the great persuader that we could apply to our own life? The Orach Chaim, right? The great Orach Chaim, what does he say? That we each have a little persuader voice inside of us. That's the Yetzer Hara. Every person has an evil inclination, has a Yetzer Hara that tries to whisper into our ear, persuade and convince us to go in the opposite direction of what the Torah has to say. So here's the Orach Chaim. If your brother tempts you, etc. In this section, the Torah teaches that an enticement to sin is not only due to external sources, but maybe due to something internal. Let it be known that there is an enticing force born within us from the day we see the light of day. Our sages derived the idea from the verse, sin rests at the door. So who is the greatest persuader, right? Missionizer in our own lives? It's not coming from outside. It's not coming from the media. It's not coming from television. It's not coming from Hollywood. Very often, it's a voice within ourselves. This little evil inclination, this Yetzer Hara that prods us, pokes us, tries to convince us away from doing what we should do. So what this means is this whole exchange between a person who's trying to persuade their family members to become idol worshippers, right? The Hasidic interpretation, in terms of applying it to our own life, means we all have a Yetzer Hara, and that Yetzer Hara is trying to persuade us today and every day, and therefore the family members and the whole strategy listed in the Torah is actually advice for how we can deal with, reject, and become immune to the persuader that exists in our life. So the Torah talks about a family tree. There's a father, there's siblings, there's children, right? There's a whole family experience going on. What is this all about? So in Kabbalah, it discusses that parents and children are a perfect metaphor for intellect and emotions. Intellect, emotions. Why? Because intellect are called parents, emotions are called children, because your intellect produces emotions, right? Like as parents produce children, your intellect produces emotions. The way that a healthy human being works is when you are introduced to information, you will process that information and you will produce the appropriate emotion, whether good or whether bad. So intellect and emotions are like parents as they are relating to children. This entire discussion is dealing with a persuader who's trying to persuade parents and children, which means this is a persuader who has the ability to have success with people who are in full possession of their intellect and their emotions. The Torah teaches us that even someone who serves God with the full gamut of their intellectual and emotional capacity can still be persuaded by the Yetzer Hara. Who is a prime example? Yochanan the High Priest, right? John Hyrcanus. This is what the Torah is telling us. This is what the Torah wants to communicate to us. Don't think that intellect and emotion is enough. Don't think that scholarship and tradition is going to be enough to get you through. Because when the Yetzer Hara starts poking, it can attack even a faith based on intellect and emotion. If that's the case, how do we defend ourselves? First of all, we have to understand, why are we vulnerable? Why are we vulnerable to our Yetzer Hara when we have intellect, when we have emotion, when we have scholarship, when we have feeling? The answer why we're vulnerable is actually very simple, right? The answer is love, right? We love ourselves tremendously. Therefore, we will rationalize whatever it is that we want to be okay. It does not matter how much Torah scholarship we have. If we, from our own self-love perspective, feel something, we will rationalize and convince ourselves why that's right. So therefore, because of the fact that we have self-love, our Yetzer Hara can get in there. Because that's the case, what does the Talmud say? Do not trust yourself until the day you die. For Yochanan Kohen Gadol served as the high priest for 80 years. And in the end, he became a Sadducee, right? You can't trust yourself, right? We are vulnerable to the Yetzer Hara. Now, there's another Talmudic statement, which is similar to this, which will again further give us some insight into how to deal with the problem. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fell ill, his students entered to visit him. When he saw them, he began to cry. His students said to him, "Lamp of Israel, the right pillar, the mighty hammer, for what reason are you crying?" He said to them, "I have but two paths before me, one of the Garden of Eden and one of Gehenna, and I do not know on which they are leading me, and will I not cry?" What is it that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai can be nervous about? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. He led the Jewish people after the destruction of the Second Temple. He practically transformed Judaism from a temple-based religion to a post-temple-based religion. You can't get more righteous than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. How could it be that he says, two paths are before me, I don't know which direction I'm going to go? The sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, gave a fascinating explanation. He said, what is the concern of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? He said, how do I know that there is not evil within me, and I just never had the moment to express it? He said, Rabbi Yochanan the Kohen Gadol, for 80 years he was righteous. One day it all fell away. How do I know I'm not Rabbi Yochanan the Kohen Gadol? One day before he expressed that evil. How do I know that I don't have that negativity within me, and it just never manifested? Right? Yes, I lived my whole life in righteousness, but how do I know that within me maybe there's something that's a little bit not all right? In the words of the sixth Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai constantly immersed himself in God's Torah and was a great scholar. Moreover, he was constantly engaged in serving God. Nevertheless, he was afraid of Judgment Day because he was unsure whether the essence of his soul was serving God as well, at the very least, to the extent that it should. His doubt stemmed from the fact that it is impossible to know exactly what is happening inside the core of one's being. This is because there are some lofty souls that even when their intellectual and emotional faculties are immersed in impurity, it's easy for them to repent since they are rooted in high spiritual levels in the upper world. There are also souls whose intellectual and emotional faculties may be fully immersed in holiness, but their soul is essentially a lowly soul. These souls can turn around and reveal their impurity at a moment's notice. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not know what sort of soul he had and was worried that he might be punished on account of the impurities found in a lowly soul. In other words, yes, he lived a life that was fully righteous on the surface, but perhaps on the inside, right? On the inside, he was not living up to the potential that he really should be, and maybe there's going to be consequences for those actions. We all have within ourselves a Yetzer Hara, right? We all have this evil inclination, and even if we live a life of holiness, how can we be sure who we are? Does this mean that we should give up hope? Does this mean we should throw in the towel? That if Yochanan the Kohen Gadol became a heretic, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not even know what direction he was going to go, then we do not have a chance, we don't stand a chance, and we might as well give up today? Absolutely not, right? Of course, that is not the answer. What is the Torah telling us here? The Torah is telling us here that if a person's relationship with God is solely based on intellect and emotions, you can be susceptible to persuasion. You know why? You might have studied a lot and learned a lot and have great arguments. There is always an argument on the other side. very important to learn in life. There is always a rational argument on the other side of any debate and of any issue. Depending on who the person who is offering it, it could be more persuasive or less persuasive. So when it comes to wisdom, there will always be someone around the corner who has a better argument than you. When it comes to your emotions, right? Yes, we may have one thing that we love, but we can easily be distracted by something else that we love. There has to be something deeper. So serving God with intellect and emotion leaves you open to the Yetzer Hara's attack. But there's a place within the soul that cannot be influenced. It's deeper than intellect emotion. And in Hebrew, it is called ratzon, which translates to desire or will. It's the deepest part of yourself. It's the very core of your identity. It's the place where things that are non-negotiable live. You have such a will to that. You have such a desire to that. Arguments are irrelevant. Emotions are irrelevant because it comes from a non-negotiable, unstoppable place. It's the very core of our being and our identity. When we are connected to that place within us, no argument can touch us. If a person's faith is based on arguments and feelings, they can be attacked. But a faith that's rooted in our very essence, simply I am a Jew, that's the end of the topic, that's the end of the discussion. Certain behaviors are non-negotiable, that's not subject to being attacked. The sixth Rebbe writes, it's impossible to reach God's essence with intellect. It is inherently limited and self-conscious. It is only with the heart's raw desire that transcends intellect that one can reach God's essence. The Zohar calls this drawn into the king, namely an inclusion in God's very essence. This stems from what Kabbalah calls the yechida of the soul that is far beyond all reason. I want to share a story with you. I may have shared it with you in the past, but I think it really demonstrates this idea very clearly. The Beluzhever Rebbe, great Hasidic Rebbe, who lost so much family in the Holocaust, went through so many concentration camps, survived, and built his life again. So he wrote a book that shared of his stories and experiences while in the camp. He tells the story that it is Erev Yom Kippur, right? And he is in the Janowska concentration camp, and there's a group of Jews approach him and say, Yom Kippur is coming. We don't want to work on Yom Kippur. They're not going to listen to us. The person who's in charge of us is a capo, a Jew. His name was Schneeweiss, who was drunk with power and authority, who was anti-religious, who harasses and persecutes all the religious Jews. He's not going to listen to us. Maybe he will listen to you, Hasidic Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael, the Beluzhever Rebbe. So the Beluzhever Rebbe says, okay. He approaches Mr. Schneeweiss, and Mr. Schneeweiss laughs at him, right? Literally laughs in his face and berates him and the fellow Jews for observing Yom Kippur. But he says, you want to do it? Fine. He says, there's nothing I can do for you for Kol Nidre. Nothing I can do the night of Yom Kippur. However, during the day of Yom Kippur, I will give you jobs to do that will not entail violating Yom Kippur. You're going to go into a big dining hall, and you're going to clean the windows, clean the floors with dry rags. You won't have an issue. The morning of Yom Kippur comes, this group of Hasidim together with the Beluzhever Rebbe, they go with Schneeweiss, he puts them in this room, and they're given dry rags to clean the place with. They start davening, right? They're davening from the deepest part of their heart, the deepest part of their soul. They're experiencing Yom Kippur like they never had before. At noon, all of a sudden, a group of Nazis barge into the room with trays of the most appetizing food you could ever imagine. Aromas to die for. There's literally meat, steak, food that they have not seen in years. And they say, it's time to eat, lunchtime, let's go eat. And of course, they all say, it's Yom Kippur, we can't eat. They ask who is in charge, and they say, Schneeweiss is in charge. So they go call the Jewish capo, Schneeweiss, he's in charge, tell them to eat on Yom Kippur. Schneeweiss says, I'm sorry, we're Jews, it's Yom Kippur, we cannot eat. The Nazi puts a gun to Schneeweiss's head and he says, tell them that they have to eat, right, or I'm going to pull the trigger. And Schneeweiss looked the Nazi in the eye and say, Today is Yom Kippur. It's the holiest day of the year. We're Jews who don't eat on Yom Kippur. We're not eating. And they blew his brains out in front of everyone. The Bluzhever Rebbe says, this guy, Mishnah Schneeweiss, right? Not only was he not religious, not only did he not observe Yom Kippur, odds are he for sure ate a good breakfast that morning, right? Mr. Schneeweiss already violated Yom Kippur. What was it? How was it possible that he was able to sacrifice his life? He did not do it based on intellect, and he did not do it based on emotions. He had arguments, rationales, why to eat, when to eat, to have that. It was not the issue at all. But when push came to shove, when there was a gun pointed against his head, you know what happened? His core identity was manifest and was expressed. And when it comes to your core identity, there are certain things that are non-negotiable. When it comes to eating on Yom Kippur, you want to debate it. You could debate yes, you could debate no. But when it comes to the core of your soul, it's a non-negotiable issue. And Mr. Schneeweiss, right, gave his life. He died al Kiddush Hashem to express his core Jewish identity. When we live with our core Jewish identity, with this element that there are certain things that are non-negotiable. Why? Because I'm Jewish. There's certain things that you can't do. The same way you cannot just cut off your hand, right? You cannot cut off yourself from your Jewish identity and being connected to Hashem. This is the greatest defense to dealing with our Yetzer Hara, that personal persuader that exists within each of us, having this non-negotiable I'm a Jew element, and that will overcome. So let's go to the 4 questions I like to ask at the end of every lesson. What did we learn today? We learned that we all have a Yetzer Hara that exists within, that has the ability to persuade us, even if we are scholarly, knowledgeable, and very much invested and engaged within our Judaism. The only way to be immune to it is to serve God from the very core of our being, allowing Judaism to be our identity, which means that there are certain things will be non-negotiable. Number 2, what would our life look like if we approached Judaism and life and serving God from that perspective? What would it be if our primary number 1 identity would be, I'm a Jew? If I recognize that the source of my life, right, my very being, was my Jewish identity, how would that impact the way that I live my life today? Question number 3, right, what is holding me back, right, from living Jewishly in this way? And then question number 4 is, what is some small concrete step action that I could introduce into my life today that will get me a little bit closer to living with my Jewish identity as being not something that is just intellectually and emotional, but it's part of my core identity of who I am. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful evening and a fabulous Shabbos.